Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate people coming to anything on a Saturday, especially because I'm sure a lot of us do not actually live in Queens. Really appreciate it. Thank you to School Data. Sorry, I'm going to try to be basically using two monitors here because I want to be able to see my own notes. I think that's kind of cool. Thank you to the Internet Society, who I think is helping us stream this. So hi, please feel free, by the way, to just interrupt me at any point. We won't mess up my flow. I kind of know most of this backwards and forwards. Happy to take questions at any point. If you have things you want to interrupt me with, totally fine. My name is Sean McMahon. I am the Senior Data and Policy Analyst for the Civilian Complaint Review Board. I am also a graduate student at CUNY Grad Center, where I am in QMSS, Quantitative Methodologies in the Social Sciences. And a lot of what I will probably be talking about today will be methodology and policy around open data. And I'm going to talk a lot about how open data really has led to major changes in a lot of ways in the New York Police Department over the last really 5 to 7 years that I've been part of that industry. Briefly too, while I am talking about me, I have either written on, audited, or been part of various teams that have investigated NYPD use of force, excessive force, and data collection around force, around the New York Police Department Special Victims Division, which I'll talk about more too, around racial bias and racial profiling, around Internal Affairs Bureau investigations. I've written on NYPD litigation data and how litigation data can potentially be used by investigators or researchers, on NYPD taser use and use of other equipment, especially around persons experiencing emotional distress, or so-called EDP persons. CIT, or crisis intervention training, which is the form of training that NYPD goes through to be able to ideally be a little bit better about their behavior towards EDP persons and people experiencing serious mental health crises. And I've been part of the team that wrote on the NYPD's response to the George Floyd protests in 2020. So just to give a sort of brief rundown, so I try to learn to use both these machines at once. I'm going to start off talking just, I think, generally around open data, around transparency, and what open data means to me in a very practical way. I'm going to go a little bit over just police oversight agencies in New York City, what they are and what they do and what they've done. I'm going to talk a little bit then about data transparency and policy analysis in police oversight. So I'm going to talk a lot about practical ways that we have used data and that data has become public and led to changes. And I'll kind of be directing this towards talking about our own open data submission, which we recently have finalized with a lot of help and work from MODA, and as well as other city agencies, including the Mayor's Office of Information Privacy, who had to do a lot of work to make sure that this was okay to publish and things like this. Appreciate that a lot. And I'll be talking a little bit then about other public data sources that may be of interest to people who are interested in this topic, and which may be things that you could potentially use in conjunction with some of our data. And then I'm going to try to talk a little bit really about direct changes that result from open data. I think, for a certain category of person, there is a part of this that really is totally electrifying. This is a case where, over the last 5 to 7 years, we have seen serious substantive changes to how policing works and operates in New York City. And that has happened as a direct result of open data and of changes to data transparency and how we use data and understand data. So I'm going to talk briefly and hopefully won't soapbox too much to make people, a little bit crazy about it. But I'm going to talk for a minute here just generally about policy and about methodology and, what those actually mean to me. So I think it's fair to say that there is sort of an ethical imperative to start with when you're talking about open data. We, as government employees, right, we want to be able to publish data that we think the public simply has a right to see. And that on its face is a good thing, and that's part of the idea of open data, and that's part of why it exists. But to me, when I talk about open data, my primary interest is really in what it can actually do. So it's in policy analysis and it's in methodology. Usually when I talk about policy, I think sometimes people just think of policies that are sort of crafted in dark rooms, which is probably mostly true, by people who don't necessarily have specific specialties in it. But usually when I'm talking about it here, what I'm going to be talking about is sort of the group of majors. It's about a dozen or so, right, primary degrees and majors that have, offshoots and things, but that focus broadly on policy analysis and on methodology, right? So this is, Masters of Public Health, political economists, of which I'm kind of one, economists, right, sociologists, all of whom are meant to kind of go through a set of common trainings and disciplines to be able to understand certain common theories and understandings, especially around, inferential statistics, regression, and sort of causal analysis in the social sciences to be able to solve these problems. Fundamentally, what we're looking at is applying the scientific method to social problems, which is a really huge pain because social problems are difficult and complicated, and people are very difficult and complicated, and they create complicated social structures that are hard to analyze and are very sometimes resistant to it, and for which there also may not be good data collection and there may not be good data available. So, when we're talking about open data, a lot of that to me really specifically comes down to those types of methodologies. Those different degrees sort of then focus on their own forms of methodologies. So I think the best and easiest example is probably a Masters of Public Health. MPH folks have been trying, for example, for a long time to get the right to be able to study things like gun violence as a form of pandemic or epidemiology. And there's huge political resistance in the United States to that, right? Oftentimes that data is actually something that you can't even look at if you're an MPH because they know you're going to try to use that methodology to interpret it. And that methodology is actually hugely effective for understanding certain things about gun violence in the United States and for understanding how it spreads and how it functions. Or if you're someone like me, I'm I guess, sort of a baby data scientist at this point. That's sort of quantitative methods. And I'm interested in things like data mining, right, machine learning, and things like this that we may be able to apply to some of these data sets. So when I started off, I'm at the Civilian Complaint Review Board now. I'll talk a little bit more about CCRB in just a minute. But when I started out at the Office of the Inspector General for the NYPD. I'll also talk a little bit more about them. But when I started OIG NYPD, and this is true too, certainly for CCRB and our policy unit, I think that one of the things that was so significant about that place, and significant silver lining, which I love, is that it had people in it who had done this work, who had done this education, and had done it to try to get to a point where you could go into society and you could bring these types of methods and these types of research practices to very real, practical things. And, in some ways, it really is just about trying to find a way to tell the truth, right? That's really what everyone kind of believed in, that if you could take public data about real problems, and in this case, policing is, I think for most of the people in this industry, we think is probably one of the most critical things that has to be improved in the US. But if you could take those methods and look at something and just do so in a way that is scientific, that is objective, that is reproducible, that everyone is capable of reading about and understanding, that you could improve policy. And the thing that is, so exciting about this in a way is that has happened. There are all sorts of examples now that I get to talk about here about ways in which, because we did this work and because we brought it in the way that we did to the public, that open data and policy work more broadly have been able to create really genuine, real, actual substantive change. That does not mean that I think policing is in a great place. I do not. I think there's massively more change that needs to happen. But it does mean that we have actually managed to successfully see that happen, and it is real. I'm going to talk to them, in addition to open data, some of what I talk about is just generally going to be kind of slightly one step tangential to that, because one of the things that has to happen as well is you have to have organizations like CCRB or OIG who go in and effectively act as kind of intercessors, if you will, for forms of data that are not public and can't be public. So one of the best examples is the Office of the Inspector General did a lot of work at one point on the hand-shoe guidelines, which are court-mandated guidelines for how the NYPD is supposed to investigate political and religious groups, right? And this had a huge impact, changed a major lawsuit that was ongoing at the time, because that data is not public. It cannot be public. It's counterterrorism data. And whatever it was, it simply was never going to be something that could be public. So the OIG had to have employees go and physically go to a location where they were not allowed. I don't think we were even allowed to take notes or anything there, and just go read through things and determine what had happened. And I'll talk about this more too in a minute, but of course, broadly found that none of those guidelines had actually been followed. Legal guidelines had been thrown off everywhere simply because the data was not public. And so, they were able to act as kind of an intercessor, as an intermediary between data that was not going to be public and couldn't be public, and between an analysis that could be public, right? So just to sort of briefly here review police oversight agencies in New York City and what their functions are. So to start with, my organization, the CCRB, was founded in 1953 when a coalition of civilian organizations lobbied the city to deal with police misconduct, and specifically around the treatment of Black and Puerto Rican New Yorkers. It was initially housed within the NYPD and was comprised of 3 deputy police commissioners. First gained civilian representation very briefly in 1965. It was opposed strongly by police unions who won this fight. They were adamantly opposed to the idea of civilian representation. President of the PVA at the time said, "I'm sick and tired of giving into minority groups with their whims and their gripes and their shouting." Sure. Police unions led a successful campaign to bar civilians from the board for 20 years. So, this is kind of a theme too. There's a strong political resistance in some cases to open data. And, this is not the only example that I'll bring up of this, but this is the type of data that, once it became open, the sky certainly did not fall. Things did not become worse. And there is a growing body of research that I will raise here that, suggests very strongly that police unions do not just make things more dangerous actually for civilians, they make things much more dangerous for police officers. I think the easiest target there is probably actually, at least for me, I'm originally a San Franciscan, and the SFPD, I remember, I think a lot of research was specifically done on SFPD and its unions because they had been so totally unwilling to compromise on anything. And, they were fighting over things like they wanted to be able to continue having car chases in San Francisco where they were allowed to fire at other vehicles while they were engaged in high-speed car chases. That's not a very safe thing even for the officer. Also, you shouldn't get a car chase in San Francisco. I don't know if you've driven in San Francisco, but was that movie Bullet? You don't want that. Real dangerous. It's just nothing but hills and 90-degree angles. Civilians were once again added to the board after City Council passed reforms in 1986. Further reforms followed the Tompkins Square Park incident in 1988, in which protesters resisting a curfew were met with unmitigated violence from police officers covering their shields and hiding their identities. For those familiar with Mott Haven in 2020, this will sound sadly fairly familiar. I will also come back to that. The CCRB at the time commissioned a special report on the incident. It concluded that there is no evidence that any effort was made to limit the use of force, and that force was used for its own sake. In 1993, under Mayor David Dinkins, CCRB became an all-civilian body that was independent from the police department. So CCRB is a very, very early model of police oversight. A lot of cities have increasingly, adopted various models of police oversight. If you're interested, NACOL, the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, I got it, wow. Didn't even plan it, has a great list of these organizations and has tried their best to create a big survey that sort of goes through all of them and gets everybody to self-report on what their powers are, what their responsibilities are. CCRB is, I think, really is the first such organization. We're, investigation centric, so we investigate police officers directly. We investigate them under our mandate, which I'll get to also in a second. But this is also, an early example of a kind of review-centric function where CCRB went through an attempt to, to gauge this sort of review, these sort of policy reports and things. This is more now the function of the Office of the Inspector General, but we still do these. The board has 15 members. They have to live in the city. Some of them are this has changed repeatedly in the last even few years as all sorts of things are changing in oversight. But right now, 5 seats are appointed by the mayor, 5 appointed by New York City Council, 3 by the police commissioner, 1 by public advocate, and then 1 jointly by mayor and city council. No one can have a law enforcement background except for those appointed by PD. And the board reviews completed investigations and votes on panels of 3 to make findings on each allegation. So an investigator goes, they perform an investigation into a civilian complaint, they investigate those allegations. The board then votes based on what evidence they bring the board to decide how to progress. In 2021, CCRB's rules changed. We're now allowed to investigate sexual misconduct and untruthful statements. That is part of our abuse of authority mandate. Local Law 47 passed in 2021 also clarifies CCRB's power to investigate allegations of bias-based policing and racial profiling. That unit has just started taking its first cases. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but that is, again, the direct result of policy review work that came out of data. That is just exactly what, it's just very, very, very pleasing. And you're someone who really got into this industry because you believed you could potentially have anything change as a result of serious, honest, objective work to see that something like that is possible. And they're very serious about it. They're staffed by some of the most professional people I've ever known. I actually cannot believe they took the job for the most part. They're willing to do it, but I'm very happy about it. And we've also adopted a new disciplinary matrix that is meant to standardize disciplinary recommendations. Briefly, I also just think this is important to realize. So, yeah, please shoot.
In your previous slide, so prior to 2021, you couldn't investigate any of these categories?
No, that would have been, it would have all gone to NYPD. So the NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau, they investigate, effectively anything that we don't. Some things actually would get investigated by both agencies, depending on what it is. I think shootings falls under that category. But one of the policy reports that I'll talk about, which is one that I wrote with Justin Richardson, who's still at the Office of Inspector General, was a report on bias-based policing that I think came out in 2018. That was a report on how Internal Affairs Bureau had investigated those cases. So how they had dealt with bias-based policing. And, not to give up the ghost too early, but I mean, they had had thousands of allegations, they never substantiated a single one. And, part of those types of reports is exactly what led to us getting the power to do it, because we did not have the power to. We would have had to legally forward it to NYPD. So, this is just a very direct list of, or chart of the way that really police officers end up with civilian complaints. The interpretation here is the vast majority of police officers will never receive a complaint. If they do, they may receive 1 complaint or maybe 2 complaints. And those complaints oftentimes are also of, fairly low level nature. They may be complaints about discourtesy. They may be complaints that an officer used offensive language in front of someone who really did not like it, right? Whereas you have this sort of long tail that you can see, right, of police officers who are serious high flyers and who receive constant complaints, receive enormous numbers of substantiated complaints. This is just important for understanding everything for how I think police oversight functions in New York City. CCRB does not have final disciplinary authority. So we go through these investigations. We have a board that votes on them. All of that effectively is a recommendation to the police commissioner. Okay. We also have a thing called the APU, the CCRB Administrative Prosecution Unit. The APU publicly prosecutes members of the NYPD in front of the Deputy Commissioner of Trials at One Police Plaza. That is a disciplinary trial. So, the officer who killed Eric Garner was prosecuted through this process. It is a disciplinary process. He was fired through that process. But again, even when you were talking about APU cases, the final authority to make every determination is still housed in the police commissioner. As a result of what happened at Mott Haven in 2020, which I will still talk about a little bit more here when I come to it. But as a result of what happened at Mott Haven, a lot of different international agencies, international human rights agencies, the state attorney general under Letitia James, the city's Department of Investigation, all engaged in public policy reviews and investigations into NYPD's reaction and behavior towards protesters. Every single one of those reports, and I think at this point there's probably a dozen, there's one even from like Physicians for Human Rights, all of them recommended that the CCRB be given final disciplinary authority, because one of the major problems with NYPD still is that we simply do not have that ability. The police commissioner, whoever they are, gets to make those determinations. There is also recent news to, which I don't have in here, but you can look up, about the number of cases out of Mott Haven that were simply thrown out by the police commissioner. The Office of the Inspector General for the NYPD was created in 2013 through Local Law 70 by City Council, primarily in response to revelations about the use of stop and frisk. Stop and frisk in 4 very relevant years up to that, only 0.1% of stop and frisk actions resulted in a conviction. I think it's also really interesting just because this is like a sidebar, but it's too interesting to me. I had a friend who I worked with, a colleague, who had been a police officer actually in Ireland. He was an Irish cop. He was a really funny guy, but he would talk all the time about how in Ireland, one of the main things that you would be judged on as a police officer was your conviction rate. I thought it was really fascinating. I've never heard that before, but it makes so much sense to me immediately. One of the big problems that I think everyone has oftentimes with police officers, things like discons, right? Disorderly conduct, summonses, low-level summonses, quality of life summonses, things that can really mess up a person's life very, very seriously, and can be incredibly painful for them, but has actually no effect whatsoever on the officer when all those cases are thrown out, right? Local Law 70 was vetoed by Bloomberg, by the way. He called it disastrous for public safety. I mostly say this again because that veto was overridden, and I think at this point we can say, based on all the work that the Office of Inspector General has done, which is just absolutely enormous, it certainly was not disastrous for public safety. It's probably dramatically improved public safety at this point. There is currently no Inspector General. The position's been left vacant by the city for more than a year. I don't know why. I'm not close enough to that. In fairness, that's not perfectly true. They actually did hire one person, but he got #MeToo before he started. Again, no comment, didn't meet him. The Commission to Combat Police Corruption, CCPC, is another agency that exists. They were created in 1995. They're supposed to monitor and evaluate corruption in the NYPD. And there is also another agency, the New York City Commission on Human Rights, which is charged with the enforcement of specifically the human rights law, which is a very expansive human rights law. Yeah, please.
I wanted to get back to the chart that you showed with a lot of complaints against very few officers.
Yeah.
So I have, I guess, 2 questions. First, what is a complaint? What does that count? And second, I'm worried that by showing this, it's sort of collapsing a systemic issue into saying, okay, we just fired these officers that are not that many, it looks like, then would be okay. And I just don't know if that's, if
I think it's a really good point.
Yeah.
No, you're totally right. Yeah.
From this.
Yes. No, I think it's, and I'll repeat it a little bit too. So, I mean, most of this is about, whether this can potentially sort of rhetorically collapse the idea that the main problem, right, with NYPD might just be a few bad eggs, right? Yeah, and that certainly is not the case. There are totally systemic problems in my mind with policing that are not even just limited to internal to policing, right? I think one of the things that as an analyst who's written so much stuff at this point about PD, one of my main concerns is just how we utilize police officers. So again, not to jump too far ahead, but in my mind, you cannot solve. This is a very simple sentence that someone said to me, and I wish I remember who did because it's been stuck in my head for 10 years or something since they did. But you can't solve social problems with carceral solutions. You can't. It makes no sense. It's never happened. There has never been an instance that I'm aware of what I would call a social problem, right? Whether that is homelessness or to some extent, whether it's crime, right? That has been simply solved by policing. Policing is one part of a public safety system. And I think that one of the big issues we have is that we use that one single part of a public safety system to try and resolve everything, right? So this should not be taken to mean that, and by the way, within this, you can still see, a complaint can be quite serious. So the other question was just, I think more generally, what a complaint might consist of. And that's the other problem. One complaint can be very serious, right? So you can have one complaint, and if it's a very serious complaint where somebody violated someone else's rights and used extremely excessive force against them, that's not seen within this figure, so it shouldn't be taken as, some sort of like global gospel. But yeah, absolutely.
And then there's probably a bias in complaints, right? Like not everyone would complain.
Absolutely.
About this. So
Yes.
it's not even capturing
Yes.
the abuse that goes on unregistered in this data.
Yeah, and the point being that, there is probably a bias in complaints, and there is. I mean, in fact, and again, this is something that I would get to sort of naturally when I talk about our policy work, but that is the first real problem that you have to deal with if you're doing policy work around this data, is that you simply have missing data points, right? And the biggest missing data point is there a severe bias in how people complain? So CCRB makes a really huge effort to have an outreach team that goes and tries specifically to deal with that problem by just going and communicating with as many possible neighborhood organizations, right, and things like this as they possibly can, to be able to tell people who we suspect may be more likely to not complain, right, if a police officer violates their rights, that they have this ability, what that complaint process looks like, right, how protected they are. And in some ways, I think even just, we have to explain to people all the time, just things like, we're not the police, like the review board doesn't sound very good to some people if they have no idea what it is. So this is all, part of what we have to deal with. And it is absolutely a total limitation of data. But yes, thank you. It's an absolutely important point. The Office of the Inspector General focuses primarily, though, on public investigations and produces public reports. Again, I just want to emphasize, to me, this is a form of open data. It is not something that is getting published to the open data platform, but this is a way that an agency acts as an intercessor for data, right? They're able to look at data that the public cannot necessarily see, and they're able to do that work and publicize the analysis. So now I'm going to talk about some of the things that have happened within police data over the last few years. So New York Civil Rights Law 50A, subsection 50A. 50A was considered by advocates and researchers, I think, often to be the single most regressive law on public data and disclosure in the country. 50A effectively made it so that you could not publicize absolutely anything about police misconduct, about police disciplinary records. So if you were a defense attorney in New York City, I cannot imagine how infuriating it must have been. But you had, as a result of this, police officers who would lie on the stand, who would lie to investigators, and that was not information that anybody knew. It was totally closed down. At one point in 2016, this is just sort of a famous, bizarre thing about 50A, there was a single clipboard prior to 2016 that was on like the 13th floor in line next to the press room, where anybody who was in the press who wanted to know anything about discipline towards police officers and what was happening in those trials had to go to that floor, and they had to look at that clipboard. That was the totality of what the public data was. And in 2016, NYPD unilaterally decided they were going to reinterpret subsection 50A to mean that you couldn't even have that clipboard. So one day the clipboard was just gone, and journalists were like, that's the end of that. Nyclu had said 50A was arguably the worst law in the nation when it comes to the public's ability to access police records. On June 10th, 2020, the New York State Legislature voted to repeal Section 58 following George Floyd protests. Again, this was immediately after Mott Haven. My fun 50A story is that June 10th is my birthday, and I was on a plane to Hawaii to go home. And we had to emergency land on the tarmac in LA because I don't know, like the wing was going to fall off or who knows. And I got out of the plane and I had like 50 text messages because every single person texted me out of nowhere. They had just repealed 50A. And it was sort of this sudden reaction to what was happening in the city. This was something that everyone had been so against for so long. And finally they just said, okay, let's just do that. And, I was going to have to quarantine anyway at that point for a week. So I had to quarantine and basically spend that week trying to fix our entire database for public production because the way that it was, this had never been a public database. And we have information going all the way back to 1965 about cases. So a lot of it is a mess. A lot of it was stuff that just was never meant for public consumption. So I think I lost 4 days of sleep that week. Well, I did absolutely nothing but try to do QA and QC on this entire data set to be able to push it out. But that is sort of the moment that led to this data set that I'm talking about broadly here, and all of CCRB's data finally actually being published for the public. I'm going to talk a little bit about policy reports now. These are all reports right here that are directly things that we built based on the data that is in public data now. That is all in open data. So we have all sorts of other projects that we want to do. I have other projects I want to do. I would love to be able to go do all sorts of fancy data mining and CART techniques and things like this. As a grad student on our data, but I am even limited still by just the time that I have in the course of a day. We have mission critical things that have to happen. There are not that many of us. So the hope with all of this data being publicized is that this is the type of work that other people now and other researchers are able to do. There was a 2016 report from CCRB showing police interference with civilian recordings that showed routine attempts by officers to stop civilians from lawfully recording encounters. A 2019 report on taser use, which I was a part of, showed extreme bias in taser use towards persons experiencing emotional or mental health crises, and showed inconsistencies in training. This helped to lead to more CIT training in NYPD, which is a good thing. It is limited, but it is a good thing. A 2020 report on police misconduct towards youths, who showing significant racial bias in policing towards Black males aged 10 to 18, who were policed for a range of innocuous activities. Those included serious policing and sometimes force against, again, children as young as 10 for things like wearing a backpack, playing with your friends outside. One kid who was just walking home from school, and police would not accept that he was not going to buy or sell drugs. I think he was 11 or 12. And a 2023 report, a very recent report into NYPD's response to the George Floyd protests. And these are Office of the Inspector General reports. Most of these I participated in or had something to do with somewhere. A 2016 report found no correlation between the policing of low-level offenses or so-called quality of life summonses and misdemeanor arrests, and helped to dismiss so-called broken windows policing. For those who do not know what broken windows is, broken windows policing is the theory. Colleagues will be upset with me for several reasons, because I think NYPD's version of the theory is not even the actual theory that came out of one paper a very long time ago that doesn't even say the thing they think it says. But the idea is broadly that if you were to go to a place with, quote, broken windows, with low-level offenses, that by engaging in a lot of low-level quality of life summonses and arrests and things like this, that you will stop high-level offenses like murders. There is not really any evidence-based or science-based or statistical-based reason at this point, I think, to believe that that is true. I've never seen any evidence that it's true, and we made a very real effort to, again, just very scientifically and objectively ask that question. And everywhere that I have seen it asked, that has no correlation. I think that it helps to make some sense of this, to understand, again, just as I said, you can't solve social problems with carceral solutions. And broken windows was an ideological, I think, and rhetorical effort to create the idea that maybe you could. Because if you could stop murder, and if you could stop homelessness or some other thing by administering more policing, then the answer would always be more policing. A 2016 investigation, as I was just talking about, into NYPD's compliance with rules governing investigations into political groups, the Hampshire guidelines I just talked about. Reports on use of force and force reporting in 2015 and 2018 led to major changes in NYPD's data collection and helped build a new force review process. So again, that's part of my work. This helped to build what is called the TRI or TRI form, which the NYPD now has to fill out every time they use force against someone. Astonishingly, I mean, I still am sort of floored by this, but when I came on, my boss at the time, the Inspector General, was Phil Ure, and Phil Ure had a kind of famous quote about how the NYPD was, in the dark ages when it came to data transparency and open data. And I think that has absolutely been proven true over and over and over. It may have been much too soft. I'm still astonished, but NYPD, if they committed an act of force against you, a serious act of force in the year 2015 or before, They did not have to write on that. There is not a piece of documentation on it anywhere necessarily. They may have written about it in their personal memo book, but that is not something anyone else is going to have access to. So you really never had any idea in New York City how often or how severely anybody was using force. The TRI report is a great example of things that have changed. Again, it shows you too the limitations in some ways, I think, of these changes, because it is not as though that stops excessive force, but it does create a very detailed form where analysts and researchers can see that, and where defense attorneys and people like this can see it and can see documentation that shows what kind of force was used at the time. Yeah, I can call it that. When we looked at that, we also attempted to understand, I'll stop for 1 second. We attempted to understand how NYPD afterwards was filling out the TRI forms. And I think it's also just kind of telling. We talked to, I won't say who, but we spoke to a very high level person at NYPD at the time who had actually been trying to do the same thing, because they wanted their TRI reports to be filled out correctly. And when he looked after about a year of TRI reports being published, he told us directly he had tried to find any report anywhere that had been filled out correctly, and he could not find a single one. And this is where you get into issues of data collection too, and how NYPD just fills out documents. So they had to build an entire force reporting thing called Force Stat, which is based on CompStat, to try and just examine how people reported on force and how incorrect it was. A 2018 report on NYPD's SVD, which found systemic failures in staffing and resources for NYPD's sex crimes unit going back 10 years. A working group had told NYPD about this in 2010 or 2011. For reference here, in March 2018, NYPD's homicide squad had 101 detectives and 282 homicides. During the same period, SVD's adult sex crimes unit had 67 detectives, about 2/3 the amount, and they had a caseload of 5,661 cases. They simply were completely unable, and had been for a decade, to investigate every sex crime. And it also came out in the same report that at least one NYPD deputy commissioner had responded by simply telling them not to investigate every sex crime, rather than actually giving them resources. Again, that is public data. That's exactly why we want this to happen, because you don't need a lot of analysis, and you may not need all of my fancy data mining to be able to drill down to what the problem is there. 2019 investigation into the Internal Affairs Bureau, this is what I was just talking about as well, handling of bias-based policing and profiling complaints, which found systemic failures in investigative practices. Across thousands of bias complaints, the NYPD had never substantiated a single one. We found many complaints that certainly should have been substantiated and that looked like extremely serious forms of bias that were not. And 2020 investigation as well, again, into the NYPD's response to the George Floyd protests. And skip ahead here a little bit for time. I'm going to talk about this just briefly too, because this is another example of open data, and this relates to a concept called OSINT. I'm not going to read most of this slide because I can't, and if I clean it up, it's not really a sentence. I'm going to sound like Gene Rayburn on the Blank Show. But the 2020 City Council Oversight Investigations Division released a report identifying a major user of the police site VRANT. VRANT is a site that is managed by an ex-NYPD officer who manages that site to be able to allow police officers to post anonymously. It is utterly full of explicitly racist comments, viciously and violently racist comments. When I first actually came onto the OIG, the first thing that I did was I looked up my bosses online. I wanted to research them and see what they had done. And all of the first links were from the rant, because there was so much content and there were so many people who were saying astonishingly racist things about really the most professional and intelligent people that I've probably ever met in my entire life. James Coble was a deputy inspector who was outed by the City Council Oversight and Investigations Division as a major user of the rant. James Coble was in charge of the NYPD's Office of Equal Employment Opportunity. He has made incredible numbers of explicitly and extraordinarily racist comments in his private life. I will leave it there for now. This is partly interesting to me because this is goes along with another concept for open data that I just want to tell people about because I think it's so powerful and because I've become totally fascinated with it, called OSINT, or open source investigations, or open source intelligence techniques. This is what they effectively use to find him. It is techniques that are used when you simply have a lot of public data. And when you have a lot of public data, you can try to take that data and you can try to build through it this sort of so-called mosaic effect, where you try to collect different pieces, and with those different pieces, you build a larger image. That is how they caught D.I. Coble. He also talked explicitly about really just breaking the law and committing all sorts of infractions. He lied to investigators. He was allowed to retire with full benefits and makes $150,000 a year. A September 22 review of leaked Oath Keepers rosters showed by the Anti-Defamation League identified, this is also OSINT, by the way, identified 45 law enforcement officers in New York on the roster. That's the largest number of any state. And a very recent, as many people may have heard who are here and who are interested in this, NYCLO analysis of NYPD traffic stop and arrest data found that 88% of drivers arrested by the NYPD during traffic stops in 2022 were Black and Latino. This is another really interesting point for anyone interested in clever things about how data works, because this is such a severe problem for a whole category of investigative analysis. This is why open data is so important, and this is exactly the kind of stuff that has to be publicized and is publicized now, because one of the ways that IAB investigators, and for us, now we're going to be looking at bias-based policing and profiling. So we're going to be doing some of the same things. One of the main ways that IAB investigators were looking at those cases was by saying, are the officer's traffic stops who has been accused of racial bias consistent with the people in the department? Well, if 88% of the drivers who are arrested by the NYPD are Black or Latino, there is no possible way for them to be inconsistent. How could you possibly have, unless you had only arrested effectively Black drivers, there is no way that you could possibly effectively ever be accused of racial bias and have it stick. This is one of the reasons that those cases never happen. So I'm going to just briefly go through here, as I know we're starting to run out of time, but this is our public data. This is what it looks like. You can look it up with this data collection tag that goes to the CCRB complaints database. But you can also, we have some legacy data on here, but as long as you're looking at these four tables, the tables that are updated daily, you'll see them. This is just where you can find this data dictionary that I produced that I try to make sure is very thorough and has a lot of internal information about this database, about the meanings of different things and categories. We have here a relational database diagram as well that's in the data dictionary that will show you exactly how to do table joins. This was a lot of work too, and I'm sorry about it. I know you put up with a lot because we had to try to go through several rounds to try to make this as easy to understand as possible, and it's fairly difficult. And these are the data columns and categories, which just because of time, I think I'm going to have to skip by. But again, you know, everyone is actually, by the way, entirely welcome to ask me directly questions or ask me directly questions through email about these things. Very happy to help anybody understand this data set. But we have a very extensive data dictionary that is meant to make sure that everybody understands what these categories look like. This is a picture, by the way, of 1PP. Look like one of those Borg things. I'm sure it's a coincidence. There are several other data sets that people who are really interested in should know about, partly because they're data sets that now that our data is public, there's every possibility that that data can be joined with other data, and it already is being effectively joined. This is 50A.org, which happened after the repeal of 50A, which tries to merge a lot of data from different places. NYPD itself now has, because they're forced to, has much, much more extensive data production and data collection processes that you can find online. This is just a picture of their force dashboard, which is interesting, goes through Power BI. You can find also, there's a lot of information that NYPD Online now posts. And Legal Aid Society, I think this is really good, partly because it has both, you know, it has our data, it has NYPD internal misconduct records, you know, it has civil lawsuits, which is a big deal if you're interested in these things. And it has things like DA and judicial records, and they tried to merge this with, you know, data from things like district attorneys who have lists, right, of officers that they don't want to put on the stand. And I've kind of talked about this already as a consequence, but just briefly, you know, there are real changes that have happened as a result of this, right? the repeal of 50A alone has allowed CCRB to publish everything from its public database that is not potentially identifying information. I certainly hope that that leads to all sorts of other research from other people. I'm very happy to help anybody who wants to do that work. Our ability to investigate racial bias and profiling is a result of this work. Our ability to investigate sexual misconduct and to take untruthful statements is a result of this work. I will tell you, if you want to see really interesting data, you should look at those untruthful statements. I think that is probably one of the things that has changed the most radically. There's a lot of history with this. The Office of the Inspector General has a lot of history with this, as they attempted at one point to publicize information about this and were not allowed to, and it partly led to this. The OIG NYPD, it publishes this annual report where you can see a list of how NYPD has reacted to all of their recommendations. And NYPD has taken about 60% of those. That to me is not actually the best number. It depends on which ones you're looking at. And we had all sorts of issues in some cases with intransigence, with NYPD simply refusing to engage us about certain things. But, 60% of the recommendations that we made were simply taken and have actually been implemented at this point. OIG NYPD's reporting on use of force data collected resulted, again, in the TRI report. Again, I do not want to say that like the TRI report is the end of all police misconduct or something. But when you're looking at a department that simply was not recording force in any way against any persons, being able to know things like the races of people who were victims of force is a really big deal. Being able to see how they generally engaged in force is a really big deal. And I think we just got to 5 o'clock. We have more time, or?
15 more minutes.
We have 15 more minutes?
Yes.
I was going until 5. That's great, because I can take questions and then I can rant if I want to. And I've got at least 15 minutes of rants. Sure, shoot.
Is this presentation available?
Are we putting the slides online? No, I will send it to you if you ask me to.
Okay.
I'm very happy to. Please.
So I know that recently the Department of Investigations had its budget appallingly.
You're really going to get me in trouble right now, but go for it.
But
Let's
so
do
I
it.
want to ask, I'm curious how the CCRB is then linked to like the budgetary agencies of the city, and who has power over the CCRBs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And boy, that's probably like, you found exactly the question that potentially can get me in the most actual trouble.
That's
But I'm still, I'll give you the answer that won't get me in too much trouble.
Okay.
Yes, I am, I think I'm perfectly able to say, and the question, by the way, for anybody who's on stream or anything, is about Office of Management and Budget and DOI's budget and OIG NYPD's budgets and CCRB's. So OIG NYPD is laughably understaffed. That is just absolutely true. That is a totally objective thing that has been reported on very broadly in the news. So that is not even me really saying it. That's just me repeating something that is a public fact, right? That, in my mind, I will say this, very directly, because I think this is fine for me to say. I do think that if you're really interested in understanding how the city maintains control over things that civilians and members of the public don't want them to maintain control over, you've hit exactly the bullseye spot. OMB, I don't work with OMB, I don't talk to them, so actually I can't get in trouble because I don't know them, and it's not my job. But it is absolutely the case that I can tell you I talk to people constantly at the IG's office, and yeah, that is probably the single thing that they're the most upset about, that they simply can't hire. It can be that not just in New York City, but I think this is just an issue for police oversight agencies. It can be the case that in a lot of places, we've seen police oversight agencies of various types and forms that come up and they come about, and at first there's a lot of oomph behind them and there's a lot of vigor, and then slowly different people and bad actors in the city find ways to sort of take powers away or make them weaker, depending on where you are, right? It is just absolutely the case that they have serious issues with their budget. Now, CCRB went through a process in the last year. I don't know, COVID has destroyed my ability to remember time at all. But we have gone through a process in the last year to try and immunize ourselves against this. That process was part of the charter revision commission. There it is. Sorry, not a lawyer. And the idea was to tie our budget effectively to NYPD's. So if memory serves, we have our head count, I think, tied to NYPD's head count. So we're supposed to have a certain percent of it. That being said, we are understaffed. Again, I am not in charge of our staffing, and I actually don't, in some cases, know that much about it. But I can tell you, because it was also publicly reported very recently, the executive director of my agency just had to go through this and talk about it. And the racial profiling and bias-based policing unit, which I was just talking about, I think, if memory serves, we've hired about 12 or 15 people to that unit. They're totally phenomenal people. But I think that John Darsh, who is the executive director of the agency, was saying that, I think he was saying we wanted something more like 40 to 50 people for it. And that was supposed to be with part of the head count. I do not know how that is the case. My understanding was our head count was supposed to be tied. So I simply don't understand it. That may also be part of, things like hiring freezes and stuff like that, which is my understanding, again, may have affected DOI quite a bit. So, but I would say anybody who wants to push legislation for bodies like this should definitely think about how to ensure that those agencies and organizations are properly staffed, because it is absolutely one of the biggest problems. And ideally, we should be able to get the biggest professionals in the world. When the Inspector General's office was new, we hired Phil Ure, and Phil Ure is top. He was a national academic. I mean, it was a huge get to be able to get Phil. When I started at the IG, I have a very long work history. I was a coder in California. I was a lot of different things. I graduated on stage at UC Berkeley, and I had a Cisco Certified Network Administrator certificate when I was 15, and went to college when I was 15, and they paid me $40,000 a year when I started that job. It strangely, oftentimes seems that there is a total inversion. Average salary, by the way, for NYPD officers is $113,000 a year. There are 50,000 members of the NYPD. Office of Management budget is worth looking into. Anybody else want to get me in trouble? Sure.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the CCRB collects and publishes any data on possible drop-off points in your own forms. So both the calling in to complain funnel, as well as the online form to submit complaints, as well as who the product owners are for those complaint forms, and if any user research has been done on possible friction points there.
And just to be clear, you're talking mostly about just places where people might, people who are going through the complaint process might fall off. Yeah, we've had a real interest in this, and I think probably we should take more of an interest in it at this point, because of exactly what you're saying. There is a thing called the James Blake Fellowship. James Blake is a tennis player who, for people who don't know, was seriously assaulted by an NYPD officer who said nothing to him and sort of like just came at him like a freight train one day because he confused him for somebody different on the street. It was like outside of a really ritzy hotel, to think of anyway. And part of the city's negotiation with James Blake was to create a James Blake Fellow who was at the agency for several years. We may be due to have another one. But that fellow tried to produce a report on this, and she tried to do a lot of work to go specifically to families I know and talk to them quite a bit and try to understand more about, why certain people, specifically people who had dropped off right in the complaint process, and to try to understand that. Part of that, came about, I think in some ways exactly like you might expect, that it's very difficult to go through a complaint process that forces you to come into Manhattan, to South Manhattan. If you have a job, if you have 2 kids, and this is something that may drag on for a year, it's very difficult to get some people to go through that process, and it's important. So CCRB has changed a lot of its processes there, and at this point, I think we're much better positioned around that, actually, at least around that issue, partly because CCRB actually also now has the power to self-initiate complaints. It's a very new power that we have. So we no longer actually are required to have a civilian go through that process. I can't, part of the reason I don't say much about it is because it's so new, I have no notion of its consequences yet. All I can say is I'm happy about it. But yes, I think it should be something that we study more. I can tell you I will make an effort actually to study it more because it is something that in my position sort of actually maybe the next thing when I'm done with what I'm working on right now that I really would like to look at is, can we make comments about that? And there are city processes that are open data processes like Executive Order 45, which is supposed to get us to go through some of these questions about the races of our complainants and witnesses and things like this, to be able to decide if we have issues with who we give services to. That's really difficult to get to through CCRB because anybody who comes in, we have to serve. But that doesn't mean that there isn't also, systemic racism so broadly across the city and in all sorts of different ways that those people are simply, certain groups of people are simply much, much less likely to be able to follow through with the complaint process, right? So that should be our responsibility to fix.
Very quick question.
Mhm.
Can we figure out, looking at the data, which complaints were self-initiated?
No, because I don't know that there are any yet. I think that if there are, there may be one. But it has been, there is an open question as to what that will look like. And how we should engage with it. I mean, I think the most obvious cases will end up being things like, for example, if I see something on Twitter, right, that is totally horrific, to me, that probably should be a self-initiated complaint. That's me talking now. That's not necessarily CCRB talking. So, yeah, just an issue.
So is that new? Is it like?
It's pretty new.
Weeks old?
Yes.
Like
No, it's not weeks old, but I think it's within that. These are the other problem is that these are things that sort of they aren't just. Right, chop cutoff dates. Some of them are like they get an issue. So I think we gained, for example, the right to investigate bias-based policing in 2021. But you have to put together an entire unit for it. You have to do all this work. So we have to develop rules for that and things like that. That's more of the issue. So it's ongoing. Sorry, please.
Can you talk a little bit more about the data you have about where when you make a certain recommendation for discipline and it gets downgraded by the commissioner?
Yes.
You may have gone over it
No, I probably skimmed past it. So within this data, this is, unfortunately, I know this is so annoying as an answer, but it is so much easier with the data dictionary because this is just partly how it's built. But in general, what you're looking at here is you can see this CCRB on the right side middle, CCRB allegation disposition, NYPD allegation disposition. So these are effectively the easiest spaces where you'll see that. And then there's an NYPD officer penalty, which tells you exactly the penalty days, right? So vacation days, someone's docked and things like this that will happen. So it is all within that, and you can see there's several different ways also to measure that we've tried to measure, compliance and agreement. So but it's much more obvious and overt when you actually have the data in front of you. But yes. Anybody else? I think we're actually almost right at time. You got 2 minutes if somebody shoot.
I have a specific question, so maybe I should just follow up with you on that. But
No, it's great.
Looking at some of your data, and also looking at the data the law department publishes on civil actions against police officers. Yeah. And I'm looking for a way to sort of figure out, if the incidents are actually the same. The data you publish is great because it goes back to actually what the incident is. The law department's data is less useful in that. So I wonder if that's anything you've looked at, and if you have any ideas about connecting those two data sets.
Well, if you're just looking at connecting officers, tax ID.
Mm-hmm.
Now that is also very new to be able to publish tax ID. But that is the sort of I know this is another weird issue, but there's a lot of John Smiths and so on, right?
Yeah.
So tax ID is considered the singular unique validator. An NYPD officer should only ever have one tax ID outside of extraordinary circumstances, 1 in a million, literally, circumstances, right? That will be a total joiner. And I think that they have tried to start publishing that. I believe so, but don't quote me on that. But if they have, that is the intention. And there were a lot of organizations, NYC and things like this, who were concerned specifically with tax ID and tried to ask us, please. It's the reason that we ended up being able to publish it, because they specifically, exactly for what you're talking about, they wanted it to get published because otherwise it becomes a kind of a mess and you have to try to work out dates of birth, right, and stuff like this, that becomes very, very challenging. But because we have that now, we should have a unique identifier that lets everybody do that. Yeah. Anybody else? Anybody else want to say something really controversial? It will make a lot of people online angry. Otherwise, I can find one. Shoot.
Obviously, some of the information you've put up can have made the officers happy. You obviously cited that piece about the, the rants online. Have any of the staff at the CRB been personally targeted?
No, I don't think so. A little worried about that sometimes, but then I just start to think about something else. I think there have definitely been moments in the CCRB's existence when people were threatened, for sure. The rant doxes people, definitely. So people have been doxed. That happens. But not so severely. I think that one of the reasons for that is really just that there is actually a core of people who post on forums like that. There's a very small number, really, of people. For the most part, really, I've talked to so many police officers at this point in this job. I've spoken to them. I've been through, I think, effectively all of the trainings that NYPD does in their training academy at Queens. And officers oftentimes will talk very openly to you about things. And, a lot of officers are not against most of the stuff that we publish. Officers, for example, don't really necessarily think that they should be social workers. That's actually not something that they do want to do. I remember when I went to the CIT training, to crisis intervention training with them, the sergeants, basically, they treated it seriously, and there was, it's a really good training, it's a week long, and there's a moment where, suddenly you're watching all of these very New York sergeants all meditating in a room together, and you're like, this is surreal, and I don't want to say anything to throw off the delicate balance, But, at the end, they basically said to me all the same thing, which was, yeah, this is good, and I'm trying my best to care about this and understand it, but how am I going to do anything differently? And I will give one story about a CCRB case that is so relevant that it's a great way to close this out. So while looking at homelessness, which is a major issue for me, and interaction with the police, there is a case that CCRB had where there's a homeless person in a park who had a hammock. And it was one of those parks, this argument aside, this is one of these parks that effectively, homeless persons are told, you can go and be here, go sleep here, right? Anyway, and he's told in the morning at 7 a.m. to take the hammock down. He doesn't really want to do it because it's 7 a.m. and he wants to sleep. They talk him into it. He says, okay, I'll take the hammock down. He takes it down. They're annoyed with him and they remove him as EDP. They remove him as an emotionally disturbed person, which he's not. That ends up being a substantiated case for CCRB. You're not allowed to just do that because you want to or because you're upset with somebody. He is removed to the hospital by the police officers. Okay, what happens if you're removed to the hospital? Nothing. What can they possibly do? He doesn't have insurance. He's going to go see a doctor and talk to them for a minute. The doctor's going to say, I can't do anything with him. He releases him. That person goes to the Parks Department to try to reclaim all of his possessions because he's a homeless person and he has his possessions in a cart and 2 bags. The Parks Department has incinerated all of his possessions. So he now is EDP and he starts smashing his head into the tile floor to try to kill himself. Now officers have to be called to come and restrain him so that he doesn't kill himself in the middle of the Parks Department. Those officers can't be subbed because in fact he was a serious danger to himself. That is a really good lesson for how you cannot solve social problems with carceral solutions. Those police officers didn't ask for that. They don't want that. That guy does not want to be there in that day, dragging that poor person off because the Parks Department incinerated his stuff because NYC just doesn't know what to do with him and doesn't have a dedicated mental health care system. Anybody else? I think that is our time. Are we supposed to go to someplace? I think we're supposed to go back to the lecture room, probably.
It's the end of it.
We just
Happy hour.
we just do happy hour right here. We just start drinking. That's awesome.